Welcome back, guys. And in this video, in our series of JavaScript nuts and bolts, we are continuing to see how to use default parameters. And in this video, I'll be showing you specifically how to play around with the undefined and the effects it can have when using default parameters. So without further ado, let us dive in and see the effect of using undefined as default parameter. So as usual, I'm going to create a function here. Just take your time and be playing around to write these functions. It will just help you to understand and to get the lesson much better. So I'm going to create a function here by the name test. Let us use test undefined like so. And of course, this is going to be a function. And our function here, for now, I pass three parameters. Of course, that is the ID. And then, as usual, I'm going to pass the location. By the way, if you do not understand what I'm doing here, kindly check my previous video on how to use the default parameters. So on this location, this is going to be an object, and you are going to have the first value for this object to be the host. So I'm going to pass here the host, and for the host, the value is going to be let us say localhost. Then we're also going to have port, yeah. And for the port, the value is going to be now let us use 7,000. And lastly, we're going to have a value here URI, and for the URI, for now we'll just make the default to be employees like that. That is enough for now for the parameters. And then down here inside here, I'm just going to console.log. And for this value, I'm going to console log, let us say fetch from, and I'm going to concatenate location dot host like that. And then I'm going also to concatenate location dot port and like so. And lastly, I'm going to concatenate location or rather URI, the URI. So after doing this, I'm going to between the fetch from and the location host, I'm also going to add a string here, and this string will be HTTPS like so / and then between the location host and the location post, I'm going to add for now I'm going to add a full colon like so. And lastly, between the port and the URI here, I'm going to add a / right? So if I just copy my function down here very fast, let me paste my function here like that, and then just pass our default value for ID like 3, and then I hope I have no errors. And then if I run this, yeah, so I have no errors. So when I run this function by default, this is what I get since it is using the default values, which are location, localhost, and the port 7,000, and the URI here, and then fetch from. This is what you're seeing here. So what I want to do now, I want to use an undefined statement. That is, for example, you're calling this function, and by default, you pass an undefined statement. Then what will happen is that the function will result to use the default parameters. So for example, now if I use 3 for the ID, then I use undefined for the location, like so. If I run this will automatically use the default parameters. So that is the first thing you need to note about using undefined in your function. If you have declared a default parameters, and then your function will result to use the default parameter. So this is a good use case, since sometimes it might be by mistake that if you're writing a code, you have forgotten a value. And if you run the function, then it will result using the default value, which is a good thing. But also it can be a bad thing. For example, you might be seeing different value in the result, not understanding why you're getting that value, and yet you've declared, or rather you have specified a value somewhere. This is the first thing I wanted to show you guys about the undefined. So another thing that I wanted to show you guys about the undefined and default parameters is that, for example, now if I take this ID, our ID in our case here is a required value, yeah, since it does not have any default parameter. So if I place this value to be in the middle, or rather at the middle, then this brings another issue. You know, in many languages, it is required by default that these parameters which have default value follow the one that do not require default value, yeah. But in our case here, JavaScript is not strict. This will still allow you to run the code, but it is not a good thing to write your code this way. So, for example, now if I try now again to pass just 3, assuming I'm just passing the 3, which is for, let me actually do this first. Let me actually add ID here before I run this function. So we shall have ID, something like that. And then between ID and the URL, let us have a space. Yeah. So now if I try again now to run this function with my ID as the middle parameter in this function, this will of course not throw an error, but you just see. Guys, as you can see, this is not a very good output. You have so many undefined, which is kind of problematic. So what you want to do is that when you move your required parameters to the middle of the default parameters, then by default, what you want to do is that, for example, for this location now, when you're calling this function, then you'll have to pass undefined. That is, if you do not have any value for your default parameters, then you'll have to use undefined so that your function knows that the first parameter in your function does not require any value. Otherwise, you'll get an error. So if I run this now, as you can see, this is 3, not a number. Let me just modify this function like that. Yeah. If I run this again now, you can see that we have fetch from 3, then our URL like so. So by default, when you're using values, or rather when you have passed values that are required by your function and you have placed them in the middle of these parameters, then make sure that you have default values for your other parameters which come before that required value. In my case here, I'm using ID in the middle of these parameters. Then by default, I have to set a value for this first parameter. Otherwise, it will throw an error, right? So that is the major thing I wanted to show you guys when using undefined statement. Number one is that default parameters, when you pass undefined value, they will resort to using the default parameters that you have declared. And number two is that when you're using this required value with the default parameters, just make sure that you pass undefined, or rather you specify the values for the default parameters. Otherwise, you'll get this error of undefined in your values. If you like this video, please leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe, and until we meet again, bye bye.